Finally, in this session, our last presentation was
well, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. What I would like to present today here is, well, not exactly that, because that will end my talk right now, but what I want to present here today are the first results of my research into the circulation or non-circulation of Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley's novel, Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. I want to draw a line quite broken and obviously very, very rapid from its original publication in 1818 to the present day. Frankenstein is a text written by a woman, not yet 19, that may be of interest for us in this conference, since it is conventionally seen as having originated one of the great global myths of Western modernity, somewhere between the Enlightenment culture of sensibility and Romanticism. Its global circulation has been, therefore, taken for granted, and I want to discuss that. First of all, I would like to point out that the extraordinary evocative power of Mary Shelley's novel rests, in my opinion, on its ability to absorb and address key concerns of its time. The hope and frustrations, the unforeseen consequences of the previous generation, or the scientific and technological development associated to the Industrial Revolution and of the revolutionary cycle started not only with the French Revolution, but, and I want to stress that, with the Haitian Revolution of 1791, the slave revolts of Barbados and Sierra Leone, and the Ludite uprisings between 1811 and 1816 that took place around the same time as the writing of Frankenstein. Here you have an image of Mary Wollstonecraft that Fred Parker mentioned today, who was the mother of Mary Shelley, William Godwin, her father, and Percy Shelley, her partner. More specifically, gender, the political, gender, and in large part racial implication of these concerns are linked, in my opinion, to the coexistent crossover and tensions between the Enlightenment culture of sensibility and the Promethean will of the romantic hero and his creations. A hero associated with a new sensibility and, in fact, a new masculinity perceived as disruptive and destructive. From all these points of view, the novel lies in one of the hottest spots of the debate of new humanitarianism as reformulated in the late 18th century and early 19th century. One that drew strong parallels, and that's important to understanding Frankenstein, between abolitionism, women's emancipation, and workers' struggles. In this context, or rather context in plural, the construction of the very idea of the natural rights of all human owes much more than has been stressed to Rousseau's maxim, I feel, therefore I am. The same sensibility that makes Shelley's monster human and capable of appropriating the name of its creator also makes him aware of his monstrous identity and of his monstrous solitude. It makes him see that sensibility equals sociability, and that to fail to connect is to kill. In fact, it is Victor Frankenstein's failure of sensibility, fundamentally, and this is important, connected to an aesthetic failure, what calls for disaster and sets the story itself in motion. To tell that story, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley used and subverted the tradition of the epistolary novel arranged around a series of concentric narratives. These begin with the letters that a young explorer and scientist that is in search of the Northwest Passage writes to his sister in Britain to tell her the story told to him by Victor Frankenstein, who in turn tells the story of his monstrous creature, who finally speaks for himself and states or pleads his case. The character who receives those letters, Margaret Walton Civil, who shares the initials with Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, appears in a first reading off-center, outside the story. Yet, her silent voice is essential to a narrative whose center lies not necessarily inside, but somewhere on the margins. And on those margins, as in Conrad's Heart of Darkness, where there waits a woman who, in her romantic retirement, reads about what is happening outside, far away, in the world of the Promethean heroes, exploring the outer reaches of civilization and empire. However, what is sent to that woman is not a single story, but a series of overlapping and conflicting voices. In fact, she is sent questions which actually challenge the very possibility of establishing any moral or political judgment that can be considered in any unambiguous sense true or virtuous. Therein lies, in my view, the vitality and the profound historicity of the fears and scandal that Frankenstein provoked in its day and is still capable of provoking even now. But, however, again, if we remain trapped in a sort of postmodern celebration of this chorus of voices and multiple meanings, we risk reinforcing conventional and historically narcissistic metaphors about the very existence of universal, timeless fears or monsters. As we all know, stories mean different things in different temporal, cultural, and social contexts. The history of the readings of Frankenstein, of the reception of Frankenstein outside Britain, is still to be written. Is Frankenstein a global myth or only a Western or Anglo-Saxon one? Are the questions that Frankenstein poses transcultural? Are they global? Were they global in the 19th century? In what circumstances? And how can we reach that? The best global history is starting to appreciate the sometimes crucial interest inherent in that which does not circulate. Text and people that do not travel, that are not really connected, or only in a very ambiguous ways. To what extent does this apply, non-circulation, to a text that has the kind of canonical status now enjoyed by Frankenstein? At this stage of my research, I believe I can make the following remarks. First, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, today considered the epitome of romantic sensibility, was not part of 19th century European romantic culture, not outside Britain, and they are very much on the margins. So, other editions of Frankenstein, there were three important ones during the life of Mary Shelley. And this is the first French edition, the only one that was based on 1818 text. And here are some data that I want to comment. With the exception of France, where it was translated in 1821, and the United States, where it was first published in 1833, the novel did not circulate around Europe and Latin America until the 20th century. I am of course aware that the English and the French versions were able to travel among restricted audiences and that indirect references to the text appear in various media before the 20th century. However, such references, at least for what I know now, were small in number and of little interest outside Britain, Ireland, and the United States. The sphere in which the story reached wider audiences and the myth was initially constructed was that of the so-called illegitimate theatre from 1918-23 in Britain and a few years later in New York and in Paris. It was in the 20th century when it moved into the cinematic sphere, thus acquiring a global or at least broadly speaking Western dimension. And this occurred at the height of Expressionism, just as fascism and Nazism were on the march. And that's important and highly significant when it comes to accurately establishing what we mean when we talk of the myth of Frankenstein. Third, the transtemporality and transculturality of Frankenstein was achieved or were achieved thanks to a systematic amputation of the major role played by dialogism, using Mikhail Bakhtin's term, so crucial in the original text of 1818. I shall quickly run through, and how much time do I still have? 5 minutes? Okay. I shall quickly run through what is lost or altered in the theatrical and film versions of Frankenstein, of Mary Shelley's story. There are countless and important changes, but I want to emphasize here, in relation to the theme of this session, the crucial fact that the monster, whose voice is the most eloquent in the novel, is completely silenced in the theater and in the cinema, because in both cases the monster is mute. Moreover, his brain is now the wrong brain. Victor Frankenstein chose the best brain he could find. But in the 20th century and in the Universal Pictures or Hammer Pictures studios, the brain is now the wrong brain because it's the brain of a murderer, a telling aspect, and that's very interesting for the history of science. In an age, the early 20th century, that has been considered the neurological age, the age of brainhood ideology, an age in which the brain is seen as the basis of individuality, rather than the ability to feel being regarded when the novel was written as an essential condition of humanity. In short, Mary Shelley's novel makes Frankenstein monster human. It's a stage adaptation, and that's what is the most interesting of the novel. It's a stage adaptation and its cinematic treatment from the 1930s to the 50s, especially with the iconic film by James Whale, make the monster subhuman. My final point today moves now in a kind of pirouette, or I don't know how you say pirouette in English, in a kind of pirouette from the novel, the theater, and the cinema to the academy. Frankenstein myth has undergone one last twist, notably since the 1980s, although there are precedents as far back as the late 1960s, coinciding with the Hammer Studio films. There are three aspects to highlight here. I believe that rather than being a global phenomenon in its novelistic or even its cinematic form, Frankenstein has acquired right now the status of an iconic product of literary, historical, and cultural criticism. Second, the 1818 text that has been reached its popularity in a mass audience is now restored to high culture. More specifically, it has achieved a posthumous canonization within Romanticism, which emphasizes now its transgressive potential, critical, dialogical, and political. It is no coincidence that the canonization process that has taken place in the context of the debate about how exactly the Western literary canon is constructed and about its historical procedures of exclusion and inclusion is right now when Frankenstein comes back or comes for the first time to the canon. Third, taking all this into account, I suggest to end that if we want to study the transtemporal and transcultural forms of circulation of Enlightenment and Romantic text, this kind of academic studies linked to post-structuralism, post-colonial criticism, the history of science, new political history, and the history of women, gender, and race should therefore be treated not only as historiographical references, but as the subject of a specific historiographical analysis, one capable of shedding light on the text's changing historical meanings and audiences. It is so because, in many ways, I believe that that type of academic studies, and I include myself here, have played or are playing a fundamental role in recreating the Frankenstein myth and assuring its transtemporality in the late 20th century and early 21st century. Thank you.